The wedding feast had barely ended when the riders appeared on the horizon. In the great hall of Château de Montclair, candles still flickered across tables laden with untouched wine and bread. Lady Isabeau de Ravenne, married only hours before, stood at the window in her ivory gown, watching torches move like fireflies through the darkness. Her husband, Lord Guillaume, had left at dawn to defend the eastern border. He promised to return by nightfall. The torches told a different story. Her handmaiden whispered, "My lady, we must hide." But Isabeau knew the truth that every noblewoman learned from childhood. There was nowhere to hide when conquest came calling. When castle walls fell, marriage vows meant nothing to the victors. She was not a wife anymore. She was a prize. If you're drawn to the brutal realities of medieval power and what happened when noble families collided, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us uncover more stories buried in monastery records and forgotten chronicles. Now back to the story. The gates of Montclair shattered before midnight. Iron rang against stone, and the screams of dying guards echoed through corridors where wedding songs had filled the air just hours before. Lord Armand de Lusignan, Guillaume's sworn enemy, rode through the courtyard on a black destrier, his banner already raised where Ravenne colours once flew. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated humiliation. Medieval warfare wasn't just about land. It was about erasing bloodlines, shattering alliances, and proving dominance in ways that would echo through generations. A conquered castle could be rebuilt. A dishonoured noble family could not. Inside the keep, Isabeau and 12 other women, noble guests who had attended the wedding, were herded into the great hall. Their silk gowns, meant for celebration, now marked them as spoils of victory. De Lusignan's soldiers moved with methodical efficiency, separating servants from nobility, cataloguing jewels, inventorying everything of value, including the women themselves. Armand de Lusignan entered the hall like a king claiming his throne. He didn't need to raise his voice. The silence did the work for him. He walked past each woman slowly, appraising them as one might judge livestock at market. When he reached Isabeau, still in her wedding dress, he smiled. Not with warmth, but with the satisfaction of a man who had won something more valuable than gold. "The bride of Ravenne," he said softly, still warm from her vows. What followed became the subject of whispered accounts in monastery chronicles, carefully worded to avoid explicit detail yet impossible to misunderstand. Medieval scribes described it as the custom of conquest, the right of the victor. But beneath those sanitized phrases lay a systematic practice designed to destroy not just bodies, but entire family legacies. By dawn, Isabeau's wedding gown was gone, replaced by rough woolen cloth. Her marriage, unconsummated due to Guillaume's absence, would never be recognized. In the eyes of the law and the church, what happened in that hall made her damaged property, unfit to carry the Ravenne name. This was the point. De Lusignan didn't just want the castle. He wanted to ensure that Guillaume's line ended in shame. The other noblewomen suffered similar fates. Lady Marie of Provence betrothed to a count. Lady Heloise, sister to a bishop. Each represented an alliance, a political connection, a carefully arranged marriage meant to strengthen kingdoms. By morning, those alliances were shattered. Their families would receive them back, but as symbols of defeat rather than daughters. Medieval chronicles rarely named the women. Instead, they appeared in ledgers as transferable assets. A letter from 1247, discovered in the archives of Cluny Abbey, referenced noble captives from Montclair sent to various lords as gifts of submission. Another document, a papal complaint from 1251, mentioned Christian noblewomen forced into concubinage following border conflicts in Burgundy. The church condemned the practice publicly while accepting donations from the very lords who perpetrated it. The journey from Montclair began 3 days after the siege. Isabeau and the others were loaded onto wagons, wrists bound, surrounded by armed riders. They travelled not as prisoners of war, but as living proof of conquest, paraded through villages and towns so everyone could witness the fall of Ravenne. When peasants gathered to watch, they didn't see victims, they saw the natural order of power. Lords rose and fell. Women changed hands. This was the way of the world, brutally simple and universally understood. After 2 weeks of travel, the convoy reached the fortress of Château Noir in Auvergne. Here, de Lusignan maintained what chroniclers delicately called his household, but what functioned more like a collection of captured nobility. Inside those walls lived the daughters, wives, and sisters of defeated enemies, women whose families had been crushed, whose names had been deliberately striculated from records. Isabeau was taken to a tower chamber. Not a dungeon, but not freedom either. The room had a window overlooking mountains, a bed with clean linens, even a small table with wine. It was a gilded cage designed to break her will without visible cruelty. She would be fed, clothed, kept alive. But she would never leave. The other women occupied similar chambers. At night, they could hear each other through the stone walls, crying, praying, eventually falling into silence. De Lusignan visited each in turn, not out of desire, but as an exercise of ownership. He wanted them to understand their new reality. They were his until he decided otherwise. What made this practice particularly devastating was its legal protection. Under medieval law, a woman captured in conquest became the property of her captor. If her family wanted her back, they paid ransom, not for her freedom but to reclaim damaged goods. Many families refused. The cost of ransom paled next to the cost of public shame. A contract from 1253, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, records the ransom negotiation for Lady Eloise. Her brother, the bishop, offered 300 livres for her return. De Lusignan demanded 500 plus a public oath that the family would never seek vengeance. The bishop paid. When Eloise returned home 6 months later, she was immediately sent to a convent, erased from family records, forbidden from speaking of what happened. This was common. Women who survived captivity were often forced into religious orders, not for piety, but for containment. Their stories threatened the honour of powerful families, so they were silenced with vows and stone walls. Inside Chateau Noir, the captive women developed their own hidden community. They couldn't speak openly, but they left messages. A scratch on a windowsill, a thread tied in a specific pattern, a phrase whispered during Mass. These small acts of defiance kept them connected when isolation tried to break them apart. Isabeau began marking days on the wall of her chamber with a broken nail. Each mark represented not just time passing, but proof that she still existed as more than property. When the marks reached 100, she carved a single word into the stone: witness. Months turned into years. Some women were eventually ransomed, others disappeared. Illness, despair, or something worse. A few were married off to de Lusignan's vassals, their noble blood diluted into minor houses where their shame could be buried. This too was strategic. By forcing them into marriages far below their station, de Lusignan ensured their family's humiliation would last for generations. A papal letter from 1255 demanded de Lusignan release the remaining captives. He complied, but only after ensuring each woman signed a document absolving him of wrongdoing. Those who refused to sign remained imprisoned. Those who did found themselves released into a world that no longer recognized them as legitimate nobility. Isabeau was among those who signed. She returned to Ravenne in 1256, 4 years after her wedding night. Her husband Guillaume had died in battle 2 years earlier, never knowing her fate. The castle had passed to a distant cousin who greeted her with cold courtesy and immediate dismissal. She was given a small pension and sent to live in a manor house on the estate's edge, close enough to remind everyone of the family's defeat, but far enough to avoid daily embarrassment. She lived there for 30 more years, silent and forgotten. When she died in 1286, her grave was marked with no family name, only a simple cross. But inside her chamber, carved into the wooden beams where no one thought to look, were names. Every woman she remembered from Chateau Noir, every sister who had suffered beside her. That inscription was discovered during renovations in 1847, nearly 600 years later. The names were transcribed into a local history journal, then promptly forgotten again. But they existed, proof that these women had refused to be completely erased. Medieval chroniclers mentioned such practices only in passing, coded language designed to acknowledge without condemning. A text from the Abbey of Saint-Denis described captured noblewomen as subjected to the customs of war, a phrase that meant everything and nothing. Another chronicle from Normandy referenced the dishonouring of enemy families through their women, presented not as tragedy, but as effective military strategy. Even church records participated in the erasure. When bishops received complaints about lords keeping noble captives, they responded with carefully worded letters urging Christian mercy while accepting generous donations from the accused. The Vatican archives contain dozens of such exchanges, each one a masterclass in plausible deniability. The practice didn't end with the Middle Ages. It evolved, became more refined, wrapped itself in legal language and political marriage. But the core remained the same: women's bodies as battlegrounds, their suffering as symbols of male power. In 1312, a council at Vienne condemned the practice of holding noblewomen captive for purposes of dishonour. The decree was largely ignored. Lords continued as before, simply keeping better records to justify their actions as legitimate spoils of war. The last documented case appeared in a court record from 1387, involving a dispute over the ransom of Lady Catherine de Foix, held for 7 years by the Count of Armagnac. The court ruled in the Count's favour, stating he had every right to keep her until full payment was rendered. She died in captivity before the amount could be raised. By the Renaissance, the practice had become so normalised that treatises on warfare discussed it as standard procedure. Machiavelli's writings on conquest mentioned the strategic value of capturing enemy noblewomen, not for ransom, but for psychological dominance. Christine de Pizan, one of the few female voices of the era, wrote scathingly about the treatment of conquered women, but her words were dismissed as the complaints of her sex. The legacy of these practices echoes through history in ways we still don't fully acknowledge. Family trees with mysterious gaps, noble lines that ended abruptly, women whose names appeared once in records then vanished. Behind each absence lies a story similar to Isabeau's, a woman erased not by death, but by deliberate institutional forgetting. Modern historians have begun excavating these stories, piecing together fragments from monastery records, tax documents, and architectural evidence. The tower chambers at Chateau Noir still exist, now tourist attractions marketed as romantic medieval apartments. Visitors take photos where women once carved their names into stone as final acts of defiance. Isabeau's chamber was converted into a storage room in the 1600s. The beam with carved names was removed during renovations and used as firewood. Only the transcription made in 1847 preserves what she created. Among the names, Lady Marie of Provence, Lady Heloise, Lady Catherine, women whose families paid to forget them, but who refused to forget each other. If you've heard their story tonight, understand that it's not ancient history. It's a pattern that repeated across centuries, across cultures, wherever conquest and power collided with women's bodies. These weren't exceptions. They were the rule, carefully documented, legally sanctioned, and systematically erased. Leave a comment. Tell us what you felt reading about what they endured. And if you want more stories that history tried to bury, subscribe and step deeper into the shadows with us. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, no matter how much they tried to make us forget.